Hello, this is Michael Rushton, and I am with the Center for Cultural Affairs at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. And in this video, I'm going to talk about an article from our digest, and this one is by Michael Thom, and it appeared in State and Local Government Review, and it's on a very current topic, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Do state corporate tax incentives create jobs? This is a quasi-experimental evidence from the entertainment industry. So what is this about? Well, over 30 states in the United States, many provinces in Canada, many countries around the world offer tax credit incentives for film and television production. A question that immediately comes up with these policies is, well, how would we evaluate them? How would we know whether, in fact, these were good policies both beforehand, and how could we evaluate them after the fact? Say they've been in place for 10 or 15 years. What would we look at to say this was a good idea or this was not a great idea? It's actually fairly tricky because these film and television tax credits, they're not really arts policy as such. I mean, if you think about, most arts policy in terms of what arts councils do, what arts policy generally tries to achieve, it is, often about, creating new and interesting art, bringing it to, audiences as widely as possible, and that there should be some real quality to it. Something that makes these film and television tax credits different is there's really none of that involved. It is strictly about, is production taking place in this location? That's really the only question we have before us. It doesn't matter whether anybody in the jurisdiction actually ever sees the result. So a film could be made in the state of Georgia, and nobody in Georgia actually ever ends up watching the movie, and that would not be part of it. The whole point is, does it actually create production? That's the issue. And so it's not really arts policy, it's more industrial policy than anything else. And it should be evaluated as industrial policy. So how would we evaluate industrial policy? Well, we'd say, well, if it's a good policy and it's about the economy, then the outcome of these tax incentives should make the state economy better off. Did the general, wage rates, employment rates, whatever measure you want to choose, did the state become overall wealthier as a result of these tax credits? Note that it is not enough to say, did the particular activity that was being incentivized increase? Because you can always do that. Okay, so for example, let's take the state of North Dakota. In North Dakota, you have agriculture as a big part of the state, though it's mostly grains. And it's grains because they are far away from major markets. Grain is fairly easy to ship, and it makes a lot of sense. You don't get a lot of fresh vegetables grown in North Dakota. The growing season is too short, and you're far away from where most people live. Now, if the state of North Dakota decided we really want to increase the production of cucumbers in this state, they could, right? They could introduce a whole bunch of tax incentives trying to get farmers to build greenhouses so that they could actually grow cucumbers under glass, more or less, in the state. It'd be possible, and it could be done, but you would never evaluate that policy by saying, well, we implemented these giant tax incentives for growing more cucumbers in North Dakota. Did we get more cucumbers? Because the answer is probably yes. You incentivize something enough, you're going to get that activity. But you probably made the state worse off because you probably directed a lot of resources that would have been far more usefully employed in some other activity into growing cucumbers. So you can't just look at the output of the subsidized sector, because of course you can increase that. But that doesn't mean you made your state any better off. And in general, most economists would say most policies like that actually make your state worse off, because markets are pretty good at directing resources towards what are the things that are most valuable to produce. And tax incentive policies in general are trying to steer things towards particular things, less of that more of this. And it's not really clear to most economists that this is a really sensible policy. Um, is film and television production an exception to that general rule? Well, maybe. One thing that people note about film production is that it tends to happen in clusters. Most films and TV shows are made as projects. So a producer brings together a big creative team and lots of technicians and so on to sort of film the project, get it done, and then everybody goes their own way to work on different projects. And that kind of economy is really only going to work if you have what we call a thick market. In other words, lots of projects and lots of skilled workers. Workers are only going to locate in a place if they want to locate in the industry, if they know there's lots of activity going on. So if you really want to work in the film business and get lots of work, you're probably going to want to be in one of the clusters like Los Angeles, Atlanta, Vancouver, New York City. Likewise, people who want to make shows want to go where all the technical talent is. You don't want to try and film something or develop something where in fact there's very little expertise. And so things tend to get clustered. So we could say, maybe film tax credits are an exception to this general rule in that a state is trying to form a cluster. The problem here is that it's really hard to just start one from scratch, especially if you're sort of already behind in the game. So if you decided, for example, that you think there's a possibility for making a real film and television hub in Boise or Birmingham, you've got a steep hill to climb because there's already these clusters taking place. Now, some states have really gone deeply into this, convinced that it'll work. State of Louisiana, for example, is now in for over $2 billion in subsidies to the sector. And so it had better be the case that this is paying off. Now, what this research paper finds is that it doesn't seem to have worked. It takes different states that have gone most heavily into producing film and television tax credits and finds that it's a negligible effect on the state's economy. They just don't seem to have paid off, even though for each of the states he looks at, we are talking about billions, literally billions of dollars in tax subsidies. You end up moving some resources out of other sectors into film and television production, but it just doesn't really give you anything for the economy as a whole. Now, anytime I look at any new paper that's analyzing a particular question, I always like to see, well, where does this fit in with what everybody else has found? And what Professor Thom has found really is in line with essentially every other serious empirical study I've seen on this. Namely, nobody is finding any evidence that this is actually a very good jobs policy, that it's very good economic policy. It just really doesn't pay off. Why do states do it then? Okay, what's the appeal? I think there's a couple of things. One is there's something just kind of exciting about the idea of film and television. I grew up in Vancouver, and sometimes I would see crews filming for a film or a television show, and it's just interesting. It's exciting to watch, and you might see a recognizable actor on the set. And so that can kind of shape our vision in terms of whether this would be a very good policy to have. You also have had, since 2002, this idea that cities and regions will thrive if they attract the so-called creative class and develop kind of, sort of a coolness about it. Now, the originator, one of the originators of this idea, Richard Florida, even he has sort of walked this back a little bit in terms of, is that really the road to riches? So, for this paper in the digest, and it's a good read, it's not overly technical, but it does fall in line with most other studies I've seen that film and tax subsidies by states really don't do much for your state's economy.